Good morning to those in the Edinburgh hearing room and those who are following us online. We're ready to resume, I think, with Mr. Seabourne.
That's correct, Lord.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Seabourne. Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who is sitting opposite. But before that, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes, sir.
Right. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Seabourne. Now, your evidence is scheduled for the day. We will take our lunch break at about 1 o'clock. We'll take a coffee break in the morning at about 11:30. But if at any time you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we can take a break.
Thanks.
Right. As I would say to any witness, it's helpful if you keep your voice at a level perhaps a little above that you use in conversation, and maybe speak a little more slowly. My hearing is not what it was.
I think you'll find I'm loud enough. You need to rein me in for speed.
Right. That strikes me as a good volume. Right. Mr. Connell.
Good morning, Mr.
Morning.
Seabourne. To start your evidence, I'm going to ask you the formal question that I ask all witnesses. And in asking this question, can I just make it clear, I know there is one small change you want to make to your statement, and I suggest we pick it up as we go through. Subject to that, are you prepared to adopt your a witness statement as part of your evidence for this inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Now, you were the project director, the director of the project team, whichever way around you want to put it, for what I'll just call the new hospital,
Yes.
just because it's easier than using its full title at different stages. And the function of the project team, would I be correct, was essentially to deliver that project to the health board that they wanted?
The function of the project team was to support the construction and design people in order that they could fulfil their contract to the health board.
But as far as one understands that multiplex, I'll just call them multiplex.
That's fine. Yeah.
Just so we're using the one name. They obviously had a team of people, they had subcontractors and so on. And on the board side, the project team was leading, was that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, I'm going to use your witness statement just to guide us through your evidence, although I may digress from it at various points. And we'll put it up on the screen, and you'll find that there are numbers at the top of each page, which are the electronic numbers that makes it easier for the operator. So if I say to the operator, go to page 20, they will go to an electronic number. If there's any issues, then please just let me know.
Sure.
Now, in your witness statement at page 118, so this is fairly early on, you're explaining that your direct reporting line was to Helen Byrne, is that right?
Yes, it was.
Now, we're going to hear from Ms. Byrne hopefully tomorrow. And in fact, you set out in your witness statement that you were a somewhat reluctant recruit to this post.
Yeah.
You would have preferred a different role, is that right?
Yeah, I'd spent, since 1980, I'd spent the first part of my career in the health service, mostly in the technical side, and then get into general management, and then in taking over, like at York Hill, the old children's hospital. I was a director for IM&T. And so in 2000, I wanted to move on and actually manage the clinical services. And you can see from my CV, I managed acute services, mental health services, and led re-provision programs, etc. So I was more interested in doing that. And then as the policy moved on with government, we merged with local authority more, and that was a key component in joining up the health service and local authorities, particularly regarding social care within East Renfrewshire, Renfrewshire and Inverclyde. And that was a job. Before I left to come to this role, I was the Chief Officer for Inverclyde Royal and the Chief Officer for the Health and Care Social Partnership, and I loved that job.
Just so we have it on record, but when you say in the earlier part of your career you were involved on the technical side,
Yeah.
What kind of technical side were you involved in?
Well, you've heard comment here about estate management, so looking after the estate, capital projects, all that type, responsible for capital projects, so that type of work.
But were you an engineer by training? Is that
I was an engineer by training, yeah. But my dad, not a building services engineer.
not a building?
And not a design engineer.
Thank you. So eventually you did take up your role. Now, can I just say, and I'll say this now to save us picking it up repeatedly, the inquiry recognises that the new hospital project was an enormous project of considerable complexity, and we're only asking people about what in a sense are very small parts of it, maybe important parts, but only small parts. So take it as read that we understand that.
Okay.
What you've described your role as on page 120, you'll see about 2/3 of the way down your page, you say it was an administrative role.
Yeah.
So an administrative role rather than a technical role, is that
Yeah,
right?
because the setup was, as you know now, Peter Moyer, who was an architect, and he was the professional that was holding the technical part of it, and I was the person above Peter. Not to say we'll come into that, fully involved in that bit, but I was the person above that who was going to manage all the different phases of work and manage the programs of work within those phases of work. So I had the overview of the process and the program.
And I think what you were probably telling me there is that didn't mean you were completely hands off. You didn't just sit in a room and allow things to happen. You
No,
were
I think you'll
involved.
find through this process I was totally hands on.
And then you helpfully, I'm not going to go through everything in your witness statement
That's
because
good.
obviously it's part of your evidence anyway.
Sure.
And it would keep us here for longer than we need to be. But you set out, everybody knows, on that page and on the next page, a lot of the things that you were actually involved in doing. And then you touch on one topic, and I just want to get that clear from you. On page 121, you talk about having had indications that you'd to avoid an adversarial relationship with the contractor.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
It came from the government. It came from the boards, what I call the board's senior advisors, Ernst & Young, Shepherd and Wedderburn, Partnership UK. And that was all, maybe hundreds of meetings and conversations and telephone calls. And that was a key theme, because the health service has had projects, that government have had projects that have turned out very adversarial. And because of what you said earlier, this was going to be an enormous project. We certainly didn't want to go along that line of, this contract, you can only do that, and you're only allowed to do that. They were trying to build a partnership that merged both organisations to the same goal. I'm not saying they achieved it, but that's what they're talking about.
And that's what you were told to try to facilitate, is that right?
100%.
The particular form of contract that was ultimately used, NEC3 design and build, were you familiar with that?
No.
You hadn't come across it before?
No. I hadn't even heard about it before.
Do you know if Mr. Moyer had come across it before?
Yeah, Peter knew. Peter had done a lot of projects. Peter knew about NEC3 but Peter didn't have any experience of NEC3. And and we'll come on to this, when we knew we were going to do NEC3, then Peter and I organised for my whole team to do a couple of day sessions with an expert, Stuart Kings, I think his name was, and we organised that to get as much knowledge as possible. And I think Douglas Ross of Curry and Brown gave us a day seminar as well, or half a day, I can't remember.
Right. So just so his lordship has this, because you spoke quite quickly.
Oh,
there.
right, I'm sorry.
No, it's our job to spot when you're going too fast. What you're saying is that you weren't personally familiar with NEC3, but you arranged for, is that the project team to get a couple of days seminars on it?
Yep, yeah, 2 full days.
And also you said Douglas Ross of Curry and Brown gave you maybe 1 day, is that right?
Yeah, as we were going through the process to arrive at NEC3, you could see it coming. Douglas, who did have some experience, I don't know that any of them have actually done projects that they know of NEC3, but Douglas set up a 1 day or a half day, I can't remember, a seminar for people in my project team.
Now, at the foot of that page, you talk about receiving some, I don't want to use the word direction as if it was a strict instruction, but an indication that how you were to deal with the question of risk in that project. Now, who was telling you this again? Do you remember?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just for information, all the conversations leading up to signing that contract, which started for me in 2006, were between the government advisors, Partnership UK, the board's advisors, the board senior officers, right? And lots of the senior officers, Glasgow Health Board, have done many projects, probably more than anybody else in Scotland. So we had they'd obviously been lots of problems, and what they were saying was, in this new world, this new design and build world, stepping beyond PFI, you let the contractor take the strain, let the contractor take the risk, let the contractor innovate. And in fact, in your bundle you sent me, I forgot the name of the Department of Expertise at Scottish Government, they were very much on, do not tell a contractor what to do, right? So that's not something I've heard here before, but that was the ethos to my direction from my health board senior officers and the government.
And just it may or may not help, when you say the board senior officers, can you tell us who?
Well, the people I'll be dealing with would be, and the chief executive changed, obviously Tom Divers passed away, sadly. So chief executive, Helen Burns, strategy, Douglas Griffin, finance, I'm trying to think who else. Medical director would always be involved. All these people would be involved in the planning of this major operation. And part of the communications and conversations that are going on daily.
So if you, you're being told, do not tell them what to do, let them take the risk. Does that create a risk for the project if you just let them get on with it?
If I'm describing it as just let them go on with it, that's probably not really what I mean. But they were saying, if we entered a contract with a contractor and we ask them what to do, at that time, around 2006 to 2010, the ethos was, and it's from the PFI world, the ethos was the contractor knows what he's doing better than you do. I've heard you saying here, what does NHS people know about design, for example, right? So let them do it. We'll set it up accordingly. And the board's advisors, particularly Ernest & Young, I haven't heard their name mentioned much here. They did it's in my statement thing. They did a market sounding exercise, and I was part of that. And from that, they were clearly getting the message from the contractor: we can do this. You don't really need to take our hand, right? And that was the ethos that we worked from.
Thank you. Now, if we go on to the next page of your witness statement, the NEC3 contract crops up again. I've already asked you about that. Near the top of that page, you're saying that there was going to be a competitive dialogue process, and there would be a professional services contract supervisor role, and hence no shadow design team as previously planned. So the original idea, we were being told, at least by Curry and Brown, was that they thought that what was going to happen was that they and the sub-consultants that they had, a whole range of consultants, would become the sort of shadow design team once the contract was let. When was it decided not to do that?
Well, right up to a point, well, it was PFI originally, as you know, and then it was going to be capital funded by the government. And right up to a certain point, we all thought about a JCT contract, right? And then as we met the market, as I talked about Ernst & Young running this market sounding exercise, it started to flip into being advised that NEC would be the best way to go. And at that point, Peter and I had set it up as in a JCT manner. So we thought we'd have, and you can see for some of the paperwork that I've seen in the past, we had fees for the start right up to the end of the project, having a design team running along with us. And then I don't know the date, was it March 2009? I'm not sure. When they decided to go NEC3, then as I've just said, I didn't even know what NEC3 was. In that particular type of contract, you had a supervisor. So were the board going to give me a supervisor, a shadow design team, and a project team? Well, the answer is no. But I would like to add, having listened to some of the evidence, that I just wonder if I had a shadow design team, because I heard the evidence the other day that my design team, technical advisors, were giving me advice, but at the end of the day, I had to select, it was me that chose that advice. So if I had a shadow design team who were getting information from Multiplex's team, and they said that's okay, I could still be sitting here today with that shadow design team saying, yeah, we told Mr. Seabourne it was okay, right? So I'm not sure. I would rather have had a shadow design team, but bearing in mind I wasn't doing design then, why would I have needed one? So it's complex. It's not simple, and there's pros and cons to it.
Well, I'm going to come back when we come to the design process to discuss how it worked, as you can probably imagine. But one of the issues that's cropped up in the evidence is that a decision was taken basically to stand down Curry and Brown from their full role and use them in a more limited role, and they then stood down the range of sub-consultants. Now, can I just take this generally? First of all, a lot of witnesses, including members of the project team, seem to have thought that there was still what was described as the technical team, which is how they were described before they were stood down. Do you know how the change was communicated at all?
Well, firstly, you've probably seen my statement. I've used the term technical team, right? Technical advisor, sorry. And it's just rolled on. But I'll answer your question in a second. But when I was recruiting Capita, or Peter was recruiting Capita, and both of us were doing it, I was feeding to everybody why I was recruiting Capita. Nobody in my team. I met my project team met every Friday. Even when I was on holiday, I phoned in. So my project team met every Friday, never missed a Friday for whatever 5 years. And in those meetings, I was clear about what I was doing. That's because I always communicate. In terms of Multiplex, I told Ross Ballingall, Paul Serkis, he was a bid manager, Mike Sharple, sadly he's passed away as well, John Ballantyne, every one of them I explained in great detail before we started and after we started what Curry and Brown were doing. And that what brought that to the fore, because I was saying to them, remember, I don't have a shadow design team or whatever you want to call it, advisors anymore. So I had loads of those conversations. And Peter Moyer, whatever Peter Moyer is, he's meticulous. Peter Moyer would have written something to people. I don't have access to any of my old information, which is a real problem. So Peter would have dealt with that absolutely, 100%. But it's just the nuance of just having the same people running past a deadline and being involved. I could see why some of them think nothing's changed here. Right? Did I explain that?
What we're keen to do is get what you understand, Mr. Seabourne, that there is an extent to which as you'll find as you go through your evidence, that there's a bit of reference to what other people said or didn't say, but what I'm keen to do is to get your understanding of,
Sure.
of the position, whether it's the same or different. In the same paragraph on page 122, you do mention keeping Wallace Whittle on as M&E advisors.
Yeah.
Now, the evidence we had from Wallace Whittle was that they were asked to stay on a kind of time and line basis, but that didn't suit them, so they said no, and they only really came back to do one specific job, so they didn't come back as M&E designers. Would that accord with your recollection?
Partly. The health board, as I said, weren't going to run 3 teams. And what Peter and I knew from our long experience in doing capital projects, we knew that we needed some M&E input. As much as we've got lots of experience ourselves, we're not design engineers, but we can run programs of work. And it was Peter and I think it was Peter that said to me, look, we need to retain some of this. And we retained Wallace Whittle, and I think we also retained Health Planners, Buck and Associates. And we agreed with Curry and Brown we would do that. I'm staggered that Wallace Whittle think we didn't come to that agreement. And in that year, and you've seen it yourself in the evidence, Wallace Whittle reported on the M&E design, and more importantly for this inquiry, reviewed the environmental matrix in great detail. Because as you've probably got the information, and I know this anyway, that the cost of reviewing that environmental matrix was over £30,000. So it wasn't a glance. So the invoice for that and for all their work is there. So they were there to help us with M&E design, to comment on the designs, and particularly to deal with the environmental matrix. That's, I think you've mentioned it before, that was that double loop check. So for me, ZBP are 100% responsible for the environmental matrix, but we brought in this double loop in order to say, how is that looking? And then again, they'll probably come back and say it's me that approved it.
I think probably it may be easier to deal with some of that when we come on to the design,
Okay, that's fair, yeah.
the actual design process. But your evidence is that Wallace Whittle were reviewing designs.
Yeah, parts of it, yeah.
Okay. Now, in the next section of your witness statement, you're essentially being asked about personnel, who you were reporting to and so on, and you were reporting to Helen Byrne. And you asked were there any issues, and I'm just keeping firmly in mind that your retirement date was July 2013, is that right?
Yes.
So we can take you up to that position. As we move through your witness statement, you're explaining how you worked, and on page 125, you confirm that you worked most closely with Helen Byrne and with Peter Moyer.
Yes.
And also with a finance manager, which for our purposes we'll leave aside. And you say you had communications and meetings with board directors, some non-executive directors, and so on. Now, was this a sort of formal process or an informal process or what?
But the board had Ken Winter, who used to be a managing director of Balfour Beatty Europe. The government appointed him to the board, so I had lots of informal conversations with Ken. He came on site, we explained what we were doing. He was very, very experienced in the construction industry. Other board members, for example, Barry Williamson was a surgeon that used to work for me, and Barry and I had a good rapport and we would talk about things. So lots of informal stuff and formal stuff at the board meeting. But to be fair, I don't think I went to more than 2 board meetings. It would always be a subcommittee of the board, like the performance review group or something like that. But at that board, the chairman of the board was chairman of the performance review group, so it wasn't a much lesser group, if you see what I mean. So formal and informal with all those people.
Yes, I think we may or may not hear from Mr. Winter later. I think his evidence is that he made some informal visits and basically had a chat with a variety of people, no doubt one of them being you.
Yeah, and when I say I'm not for a minute saying he approved anything. I'm saying Ken came over and he was there to hold my hand. If I said which house to do this, house to do that, he would have easily given me his advice. But so yeah, it was just a bit of a buddying exercise.
Yeah. Now, one of the topics that's cropped up in the inquiry is the issue of site selection.
Yeah.
Now, the big picture issue of site selection, I'm not going to ask you about because that predates your involvement. But I did want to ask you about one topic that you just touch on, 127 of your witness statement. You asked, well, do you remember any discussion about being beside the sewage works? And you describe it as not a big issue. Is that your recollection?
Absolutely.
And you say that the board senior officers informed us that the process at the works had changed or was going to change, reducing the potential for odours. Is that what you were being told?
Yeah, and I think you'll see in the Susan Logan, who was a BM advisor, I think she wrote an initial design solution report, and she mentions the perceived odour, and she also mentions that it's getting better and it'll probably negate itself because of the work that the Scottish Water were doing. So yeah, that was the general story. I did lots and lots of public meetings. I was the face of the project, and you know what the public's like, they had lots of comments to make, and very, very few had that comment to make. And also in our general discussions, and this is just anecdotal, the hostel's been here for 100 years, it's never affected it yet, and that was that was the conversation.
Can you remember who among the board senior officers told you about this proposed change on the part of Scottish Water?
Yeah, I think it was Robert Calderwood. Yeah, I think it was Robert that told me. Who was somebody who would be very connected to Scottish Water and every other government agency, because that's the role he played and that's who he was. So yeah, Robert generally told us that it had changed or was changing from a sewage work to a kind of transfer station where sewage only really get mixed twice a year, maybe. Or that was the story. Didn't go into any more detail than that.
And do you know from your conversation with Mr. Calderwood whether anyone was carrying out any kind of risk assessment of putting the hospital beside this sewage work?
I don't know, but in my conversations with ICDs, i.e. microbiological doctors, or infection control prior to setting all this up, it was never ever raised as an issue to me. And I mean, I think the Southern General maybe had about 10,000 staff. You did get the odd person that was going to complain. In fact, I think it's maybe in the evidence. I think somebody wrote to the minister to say the smell here is terrible, right? I don't know what I was there. I was on the site for 7 years. I don't really know what they're talking about.
So other than having this conversation and being reassured it wasn't an issue, this is not a topic that really got your attention?
It didn't take up any of my time, no.
Okay. The next topic that's covered in your witness statement is described as procurement. And there are a couple of things I would need to ask you about there so that we can understand perhaps things that a number of witnesses have said about,
Sure.
about the consequences. Now, we know that this was originally intended to be a PFI type contract. Were you familiar with the concept of PFI contracts?
Yeah, I served the second PFI in Scotland, York Hill Hospital. It was an energy project, but it did give me some insight to it. I think Fraser served the first PFI in Scotland. So, and obviously through discussion, learning, going to seminars, I had a reasonable knowledge of what PFI was trying to do.
So in terms of PFI for a hospital, at the risk of being criticised by somebody elsewhere for oversimplifying, the usual pattern is that a company builds the building and then hands it on to let me call it a facilities management company, who then runs it.
An operator, yeah.
And then the health board put the patients in and do all the clinical stuff, but the facilities management company runs that building for them. Yep. That's the general picture. Yes. Did that accord with your understanding?
100%.
And the effect of that then is that the if you like, the maintenance, the general today, what the health board tend to call estates issues, are actually run by the facilities management company.
Yeah.
Now, one of the questions you asked to see if you could help us on this topic was, and I think you know why it's being asked, when the switch came from PFI to not PFI, which you've set out why that was, that's fine. When that switch came, can you recall what steps were being taken to arrange for sufficient, let me call them estates resources, to cope with the fact that there wasn't going to be a facilities management company running the hospital?
Well, that would be down to, it was down to the facilities management team, and there's a number of directors of finance. There's a director of finance for acute services and a director of finance for the health board. They would be having conversations about affordability, right? And in the affordability envelope, they would need to be considering how much money they would need to put in terms of to keep this building going in its life cycle for, well, they'll be looking at 10 years, but it's obviously going to go 30 years, and the building's got a life of 60 years. So that would be part of their planning process, to say this, we're going to close 5 hospitals and we're going to open this new hospital, and we're now going to maintain it. So let's make sure we put in the right resources. So they would be working that through, and that would go through a lot of machines before it came out at the number that they wanted to run with.
Were you involved in these discussions at all?
On the periphery, I maybe want me to play in my view or get views on what it would cost in terms of running it, but that for me might just come down to me saying, well, I've spoken to cost advisors and they're saying, oh, it's X £1,000 per square metre per week, per month, or whatever. It would be a high level thing like that. The facilities director would have much more knowledge and experience of what he needed to cover. And so I just remember at that point, not quite in terms of estate, but in terms of cleaning, I always remember the estate director saying, we've went from open wards to single rooms, that stretches the building from A to A plus, and I'll need more cleaning staff. So he would be building that into his facilities management costs.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about this because there have been a few comments on it. We're moving to 129 of your witness statement and following. Yes, so we're following it through. And the reason I want to ask you about it is the way you've explained some of this, which has been quite helpful. Near the foot of page 129, you talk about one of the things that was investigated, which was the possibility of getting a 7-year period. And you say instead of the normal 1-year period, in order to try and mitigate life cycle risk as the client would get in a PFI after handover. And you touch on that again on page 130. If we just go to about 3/4 of the way down the page, you say there could be a 7 years insurance resourcing cover period by the contractor, where the contractor was taking all the building structure and building services risk with obvious benefits to the board, which sounds a bit like, as you say, a bit like you get in PFI.
Many PFI, yeah.
So that's not just a question of defects liability in the standard JCT understanding of a defects liability period. That's something different that they were looking at.
It's a concept that, I mean, the people excuse me, the people I'm dealing with here are all very well versed and know how a hospital runs or gets run. And as much as people say PFI is a very expensive model, I only need to look at the Victoria and the Stop Hill in Glasgow, and if you go in them, you'll see just how well maintained that they are. And we knew that having that envelope of cash tied into a 30-year concession period was a good way to take some risk out of building life cycle. So in those conversations, which would generally be with both senior officers, people I spoke to, the government, Partnership UK, Ernst & Young and Shepherd and Wedderburn, with those people, we had many meetings, not one meeting, we talked about these concepts. And indeed, I think that Michael McVeigh of Ernst & Young took this concept when we were doing the market sounding exercise to the contractors we spoke to, and they all went, no, not for us.
Well, let me ask you a couple of things more about that. Near the foot of page 130, you say the board would use this as an incentive to the contractor to drive higher quality in construction. So why would that kind of arrangement, whereby they were going to maintain it for 7 years, drive higher quality in construction? Because, just for those of us who are not experts in this field.
Because just like PFI, I made it theirs for 7 years. So, you know, the first 5 years of a building is when you're starting to see some of the things, use the word, come apart, break down. And so they would maybe have to, whatever element of the building they were putting in, they'd maybe have to buy a bit more expensive to make it last a bit longer, to make it have less maintenance being the key word. So, and it's a bit like a liability period. They build for a year. We ended up saying, let's do 2 years. I hadn't been involved in a contract that had done 2 years. And that was the quid pro quo we ended up with. That was the middle ground. But they had no interest in having a 7-year liability hanging over their heads. But it might have drove quality.
The reason I'm asking you this, so let's be quite open about it, is that one of our witnesses says he was told by David Loudon that the high-ups, the CEO and so on, thought that Multiplex were going to completely maintain the building for the first 2 years. Could that have come from these discussions, do you think?
No.
No?
Multiplex will never maintain the building.
Well, we know that, but I just wonder whether, because of this exploration of an extended mini PFI, as you've described it, those who are not particularly steeped in construction might have thought that what the 2 years was they were getting was a period of maintenance.
Possibly, but I think the discussions that I'm talking about were in a kind of small cohort of people. They weren't a secret, but we weren't going singing and dancing about it. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure that would fall into anybody else's environment, you know.
Mr. Calderwood's possibly?
Well, if it was Mr. Calderwood that said it, yeah, he was part of the core team. But no, I don't. I'm just saying that anybody outside the people that were in the planning regime for this hospital, it was just a concept. We dealt with it, we moved away from it, and I don't think it went anywhere else. So I don't think anybody else picked it up, is what I'm really saying to you.
Okay. The next section of your witness statement moves on to a topic that we have been discussing with a number of witnesses, which is this thing called the employer's requirements. Now, so we're 131 on your witness statement now. This was designed to be an expression of, I think one party has said it's what you want, not how to build it, but what you want. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, an output specification, yeah.
And your position in your witness statement is that the employer's requirements are responsibility of the technical advisors. Now, of course, at that point, you've got Curry and Brown and a whole troop of technical advisors. And did that mean that the project team were leading it, or they were leading it? How was this being done?
No, the project team, and I had 3 excellent people working for me, in terms of administrative duties. They would organise the meetings, the venues, schedule all the meetings for all the people. We met many. It might not appear now we met many people, but we certainly met more people than I'd ever met before. So they would organise that. Curry and Brown were the experts in taking this forward. I was a follower, not a leader in that, because I'd never done an employer's requirement before. It was generally much more detailed specification types for projects I'd been involved in. So this was a kind of new way. And Curry and Brown had if not a framework, a process that they'd used before, and we would follow that process, and we would make sure that people arrived in order to give them the information to pull the ERs together, which, to be fair, was a substantial documents.
Can I just make sure I understand your answer? Are you telling us that you hadn't previously been involved in this type of design and build idea where instead of saying to the contractor, this is your building, here's your details, get on with it, you have the employer's requirements process. You hadn't been through that before.
No, to different levels. We would have specifications and commentary running. This employer requirement process was quite lazy on design. There wasn't a lot of design detail. It was mostly all output. I know we had an exemplar and we'd done some 1 to 200s, however many, 11 or something like that. Can't remember. So for me, this was a very low level of information, even though those books are, in terms of being specific.
Do you know if Mr. Moyer was familiar with doing this process?
He probably was, but Mr. Moyer wanted to do, and we'll maybe come on to this, much more detailed design work. Well, maybe not much more, but more detailed design work in the procurement process.
But that was something that wasn't being done in this process, is that right?
No, not really, other than what you've heard to the past about the exemplar drawing, the massing, the 1 to 500s, the layouts, some 1 to 50s, etc. So it was base information and adjacencies, clinical adjacencies. It was base information along with a lot of information. I think you heard Jim Leeper saying, we just describe and make sure you comply with all this guidance and not actually telling them how to comply with the guidance. So that's the nuance of it.
Right. Is this quite a big exercise?
Oh yeah.
Just while we're on the employer's requirements, can I ask you this? Obviously, you're somebody who's been involved in a lot of capital works and so on, you say, but not this type of exercise before. You described yourself as a follower rather than leader during the employer's requirements.
On this bit, yeah.
What we know happened, and we'll come to the detail of that in a minute, is that the employer's requirements could be changed or departed from in the negotiations leading up to signing of the contract. Now, do you think that was understood among the people who were working on these things?
Well, I know I've heard this, and I know you're going to ask me about it. The employer's requirements, the technical bit is put together by Curry and Brown. So when you've got a mandatory and a non-mandatory field of information, that wasn't me for the board saying we need this. That was them telling us you should have this. This is the best way forward. So when they then, I'm not going to use the word delegation. You use it. When they then come up with an alternative solution, it was their judgment to say it doesn't need to be in that field because the solution that is being presented is okay. So it was their set of rules, which, as far as I'm aware, they had the right to deviate from or change because they were our advisors.
Mr. Seabourne, just to check that I've noted you correctly, because you do speak quite quickly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're describing the level of detail being provided in the employer's requirements. And you made the point that Mr. Moore wanted the detail to be dealt with during the procurement phase. Now, did I note you correctly as you seeing the employment requirements as giving them, in other words, the potential bidders, the guidance, but not how to apply it?
More or less, yeah.
Right. Thank you.
The part of the employer's requirements were things called clinical output specifications.
Sure.
Were you involved in that process?
No, my team were involved in that process, and my involvement was to get it done. Right? Okay, so I had 2 people who led that process: Heather Griffin for the adult, Mary McLeod. I'm going to try and slow my voice down. Mary McLeod for the children's, and their role was to go. We had clinical output specs and non-clinical output specs, but you're interested in clinical. They were to go through the clinical specialties. I think the children's have got 39 clinical specialties, and I think the adults are about 38. I think it maybe changed now. So let's call it 80 clinical outcome specs. And they met the users. We had user groups set up then, all detailed by the health board, who would be in these groups, consultants, nurses, other people that were in the clinical environment. And through that process, Mary and Heather were to lead them through, with our health planners, who was Ian Buchan, was to lead them through what you might need to tell us in order to get your department right. Okay, so that was general high-level brief. And they would feed in things that they needed, be it relationship things, be it equipment things, or whatever it was. They would tell my two staff, who also had some other support from my team, tell them what they thought they needed, with the health planner saying, well, he was supposed to be keeping them right. I'm not saying he wasn't keeping them right, but his role was to keep them right. And I've heard you say in the past, well, these are all different, and they are. And maybe there should just be a standard format, and quite easily I could write it myself, I think, just to say you must touch on all these things. But at that point, that's not quite how it was. And you raised it, and I've seen it on your bundles on the net. I haven't looked at it for 16 years, the Ward 2A, the Shahalin Ward, and I looked at Ward 4B, and I have to say they're night and day.
But that's it's very helpful. You've mentioned that, because what I was wondering, and bear in mind we're coming at it even further away from than you are, was that I can see the process that you've explained, but when you look at 2A and 4B, as you say, they're very, very different documents. And I wondered whether at least the intention had been that there should be some kind of moderation system, so that somebody was saying, okay, have you covered everything you need to cover? Can we check that before we put this into the employer's requirement?
Well, two things. I would say that was our health planners. I mean, the nurses and the doctors didn't do this every day. They'd done nursing and doctoring. The health planner was the planner. I would have expected him to have balanced this up. That said, the other thing I was going to say is that in both organisations, from my memory, there was a process to go through, which was all clinicians. So to say, does this describe your department? I think in children's, excuse me, there was an advisory committee, and then there was a senior management committee, because the senior management committee, and this is how they work, wouldn't let anything go through to us without looking at it, because that was the operation that they were doing. So they were there, and also remember I had two medical directors, and for children I had Morgan Jimison, an eminent cardiac surgeon. I mean, Morgan must have read that clinical outcome spec. He's also been a chief executive. I hold him in high regard, and I looked at it last night and I thought, not too good.
Could I just look for your help as to who actually drafted the clinical output specifications? Because as you rightly say, if you look at the clinical output specification for Schiehallion on the one hand and for 4B on the other, they are different documents. The format is different and the degree of specification is different. Now, looking at these documents, have assumed that a clinician or one or two clinicians in these respective departments had drafted the document, as opposed to, for example, Buchan.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. But
Right.
Buchan reviewed it, right?
Right.
And I imagine, Lord, it's going back a long time. My two colleagues, Heather and Mary, might have actually drafted them from notes given by the clinicians. I'm not just sure. It's just too long ago.
Well, I hear what you say. If it had been Mary McLeod and Heather who drafted it, might you not have expected a sort of standard format? In other words, two documents dealing with two different departments, but set out in the same way?
I would just answer that by saying I absolutely expected that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But in the environment I was working with, very senior people, very knowledgeable people,
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, you get told that those 39 are done, everybody's signed them off. No, you can say to me, well, maybe you should have reviewed them, but I'm afraid I had to work 24 hours a day to do that. So,
Mhm.
so there's a bit of trust involved. People get delegated authority, etc., etc. So, I mean, I was actually quite surprised when I read it last night. It's probably the purest one I've read for a children's cancer unit.
And am I right in thinking that it's the clinical output specifications are essentially the only piece of information which is being provided to the contractor to describe the particular service which is to be delivered in a particular part of the hospital?
Yes.
Right.
And sorry, my lord, and that's when I'm saying, I think, although the ERs are bulking lots of information on them, that's where I think it's a bit light.
Sorry,
That's what I think it's a bit light when I said
right.
the information's light.
Thank you.
So that when the contractor gets a clinical output specification, the idea is that they should try at least to work out what they need to provide, both in terms of layout and equipment, everything, what's likely to have to go in there, and what kind of facilities it's going to need. That's the idea, anyway. Is that right?
Well, Mr. Corr, I would say, if you read the forwards of all these bid documents, they tell you just how good these people are, right? We had user groups up and running. So when they see these pieces of information and their health planner, which I think was Tribal, they don't think they're up to scratch. All they need to do is come back to us and ask and say to us, we need a bit more information on that. I mean, we heard from Mr. Pardy, extensive healthcare design experience, but he wasn't sure how a children's cancer unit worked. And I have to say, he has to make himself aware of how it worked. And even though he's sitting with that one piece of that one document that isn't very good, that's when I would expect him to go back through the process and say, I need more information. But he clearly didn't think he did.
And I think, in fairness, in your witness statement at the time it was written, you say you don't remember the details of them, but you have looked at these two for the purposes of your evidence. And that, thank you for doing.
Yeah, fortunately you've put them up and I can see
that.
them there.
And you're also asked a question, well, who was responsible for deciding what NHS guidance went in and which bits were compulsory and which were not? And you say that was the technical advisors.
Advising us, yeah.
Is that not the project team? That was the technical advisors, is that right?
No, technical advisors.
And you're also asked, and it's partly because this has been a topic that sort of was thought to be a prominent issue and then may have drifted away a little bit. Page 132, you were asked about how sustainability and energy targets impacted on the design. And you say, well, not very much other than making the whole process a bit more expensive.
Yeah, a bit more detailed, yeah. Well, I'm all for the carbon. I mean, I'm all for the carbon reduction, and you heard Emma White saying they're going for zero now. I think we were going for 80 kilograms of carbon per metre squared, which at the time was a very tight target. So a target handed down, I'm sure, by the government.
Can we go to 133, where another topic crops up, which is the what we've been calling the maximum temperature variant. Were you involved in this discussion? The change in the maximum temperature?
No, I think I said in my statement. I think I was told that was changing, right? And was I in the room at the time? I don't really know, because I'm sure it was David Hall, Curry and Brown. They told me they've had an instruction to change, to bring the maximum temperature and compliance of HTM from 28 degrees down to 26. Now, I'm only going to tell you my assumption of that, and that would be, I think it's the two ACADs, as we call them, Victoria and Stop Hill, had opened. They hadn't opened long, to be fair. I think they only moved in June 2009, and they were clearly, when I say they, I'll be talking about the Chief Operating Officer and the Chief Exec, they were clearly getting maybe press or pressures saying these rooms are all overheating, right? And they said this about a range of things. Make sure that big hospital doesn't have this problem as well. And that, I'm just assuming that's the conversation, so that's not factual. And so from the director of facilities who would be in that conversation, or they would contact, he then came and told Curry and Brown that that was a change. And for me, if you talk about delegations, that's the first delegation. For me, that's the only delegation, but that's a delegation to making that change.
Yeah, well, we know that the SHTM figure is 28 and the instruction was 26. I think because we're rather short of people who seem to accept that they were involved in that discussion.
Yes, so
do you know from your discussion with Douglas Hall who was involved in any discussions about this decision? Or was it just handed down? I mean,
no, I think that the discussion came from the director of facilities to Curry and Brown. I think it was David Hall. I'm saying that because I dealt with David and Douglas all the time. So the director of facilities made the change.
And are you aware whether there were any other technical advisors involved in discussing that change?
No, but I think Curry and Brown were also the technical advisors on the two hospitals in question that we're talking about, or at least one of them. And so they were having conversations anyway, and they were having some problems with, I think, heating plant and stuff like that. So there's another conversation happening over on this side and filtering into the job that I'm doing or trying to do.
Yeah, what we're trying to understand with some difficulty, because we don't have people who seem to remember it, is whether anyone looked at, could this have knock-on effects on other issues? Are there risks we should be assessing? What about bringing IPC in case it impacts on something they're interested in? Do you know any of that information?
No, I don't think, no. That's just the way it happened, and things like that did happen in the health service. And what they were doing was, of course, they're dealing with patients every day of every week. And having been a patient myself, I have to say to you, I'd rather the room was comfortable than actually worry about infection control. I know that might sound ridiculous, but it's actually quite true. And these guys know that keeping patients happy in rooms is part of the process of getting them better. So it would come from a good heart. And maybe the repercussions of it, as you're asking me now, I don't think any of us, I think Emma said that, none of us knew what that was going to drive in the end.
Well, I mean, if you take a ridiculous example, if somebody says we need to reduce the temperature in this room when we're designing it, that might mean somebody designed Venetian blinds at the windows or fewer windows,
Sure.
or all kinds of possible knock-ons. I just wondered whether you had any indication that any of these issues had been considered.
No, the key thing for the hospital, right from day one, when they changed from open wards to single rooms, the key thing is that the single rooms are the optimum in stopping the transfer of infection. That's the one. It's multifactorial, but that's the one thing that we all thought was the thing. We spent because of the Vale Leaving Inquiry, we'd spent years trying to separate beds. In the Glasgow Royal, the beds were only separated by the cabinet, the locker, right? And we spent, they've got 3.7 metres, I might be wrong with that. We spent years trying to make beds further pitch from each other, and then we come into single rooms. And I have to say, all through this, the single rooms, from everybody's perspective, was the key thing, the saviour. This will help everything. This will be better than anything else, and that's in our minds.
Thank you. Can we move on to another topic? Till beams, which come into our discussion that we're going to get to in due course about what you don't want to call the derogation. But
Sorry, excuse me, can I go back just to the temperature thing?
Yes.
You're going to come on and talk about logs, I'm quite sure. But you see that change, you call that derogation in temperature, is actually written and drafted out in the ERs, which I don't think any other one was.
Right. It was during the process, wasn't it?
It was during around about June, I think, July. I think it was written in July 2009. So, but as you're talking about the law, everything else was in the logs, but this thing's actually written down. And in fact, when I reviewed it for this process, I thought, well, that must have been in there already, but it wasn't. It was inserted in there. So I only give you that for information. I'm not making a point.
No, let's just get that up on the screen. Bundle 17, 1063. 1063. Thank you. Default.
Yeah, that's it, yeah. I think all I'm saying is, I don't think any other action got that level of input.
No. No, so your point is that somebody actually wrote it all down, given some of the discussions about
Yes.
what was or was not to be written down.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Only really the one question I wanted to ask you about chill beams, because we now know to our cost what chill beams are and what they do and don't do and what some of the issues are with them. You say on page 134 of your witness statement, if we can go back there, that you never had anyone raise any issues with chill beams, though you had no experience with them. So you took your advice from experts, which is what you've been explaining. Were you made aware of feedback from unsuccessful bidders in the competition?
In terms of unsuccessful bidders, during the process of dialogue and evaluation, our lawyer, Seabourne and Wedderburn, clearly telling us, do not take one from the other. Don't do a good thing from that bidder and put it in that. So we were, and it maybe doesn't apply to the time you're talking about, but we were kind of entrenched in, do not take something from bidder A and put it into the successful bidder B's process, because that's not allowed. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. So I wasn't aware of it, but even if I had been aware of it, I might have shied away from it because and that was explained to us rigidly. Do not do this, or you'll be breaking the European Union procurement rules. So that's maybe an issue. But in saying that, when you come on to talk to me about carbon filters, I'm going to play something different back to you.
I'd be happy to give you that opportunity, Mr. Seabourne.
Good.
The only reason I ask is that we happen to know now that one of the unsuccessful bidders basically said, look, if you're going to chill beams, you're not going to meet your air change rate target. So the suggestion is that someone somewhere in the board structure should have been aware of that before you got into all these debates about them.
Well, having been in the evaluation process, and having remembered the people meeting, for instance, Multiplex's bid, which come up in 2 vans of, that's the size of the information that we were working with, and looking through all the bids to come out with what's the best bid. It's like any bidding process, pros and cons. There's good and bad in every bid, and what you've got to do is to pick as many good ones in order to get the best bid. That bid you're talking about might have been the bidder, and I'm not saying any names, might have been the bidder that didn't have any internal stairs in their bid. So mark down for that. And I'm just trying to say it's a process of iteration and compromise and consideration, and you come out with the best example. And yeah, I've bidders who have lost got some better ideas, and bidders who have won every time, every process.
On the next page, you make some comment about the environmental data and what data was in what documents and so on. And I think we're probably easier to look at that in more detail when we come on to look at the design process that went on. But in your in that same page 135. When we've been talking about environmental data, air change rates, pressure differentials, that kind of stuff. You say the project team were involved in employers' requirements and then in the design process to endeavour to provide as much information support to the contractor and their team to advise them of the functional requirements of the ERs. But we're very much led by our TAs and Capita and the Brookfield and ZPP on all technical issues. Now, just pausing there. By the time you get to the design process, you've not got your technical team. Is that not right?
No, I've not got the technical team as it was. Yeah. But it's been discussed in these hearings that they don't have design people, and we don't. I just told you at the beginning, I'm not a designer, but myself, Peter Moyer, Francis Rath, David Hall, take that as a core. We're more than capable of looking at designs and giving our opinion. Now, we'll probably come on to this. That's not an opinion where I'm saying this is how to design the event, but it's an opinion where I'm saying, using my 33 years health service experience, you should think of this. So we're going to come on to discuss our involvement in design. And myself, Peter Moyer, and others were involved in design every day of every week. And that was the role we played. But the health board, the health service didn't put us there to be designers, but we knew generally what we were talking about. I mean, if I can give an example, my lord, we've got a 33,000 volt substation there, and we must have had, I don't know, many conversations about setting that up. That's a big deal. I've never dealt with that size before. And we went to Scottish Power, and at Scottish Power, I've got all the designers, multiplex people, and the Scottish Power people. I would say I was the person saying more about what the requirements were than anybody else knew. So I'm just trying to express that although none of us are designers, our experience allows us to participate. And if we don't know the answer, hence the Wallace Whittle contract, we know, or we think we know, I thought we knew where to get it. So it's a bit of a misdemeanor thinking that we are, as a project team, are not involved in design, are not capable, more or less, of being involved in design. We certainly are. And up and down the country, I'm going on a bit, but I think the more evidence I can give you, the better. Up and down the country, every health board in the UK at that point, and before, maybe changed now because the world's changed, has got estates teams that are doing capital projects, right, who are not designers, but quite competently getting designs developed and concluded in hospitals or bits of hospitals built. So it's what we do.
In the same paragraph, you mentioned capita, so let's just deal with capita. In your statement at various places, you talk about capita dealing with, other witnesses have also said, contract compliance.
Yeah.
Now, the capita evidence essentially is that, with two minor exceptions, one about some switchgear and one about a piece of ducting, they weren't asked to review any design, and they were simply doing this inspection supervising role. So they weren't asked to do an exercise that would have allowed them to say whether somebody was complying with the contract. Can you help us at all?
In the design stage, we're talking about Peter Moyer, and that's really unfortunate. I don't really have access to Peter. I do keep in touch, but I don't have access. Peter Moyer asked Capita and gave them a compensation event to do some design review on the information we were getting fed by multiplexes designers. And he actually done that for two reasons, because Capita didn't come on board till June 2010, to give them experience of what the project and some of the designs in the project, and also, and it's a bit later on, to look at some, because they're chartered engineers, to look at some specialist, and I'm sure we'll come out and talk about it, some specialist areas, your double loop thing, a final check on the PPVL rooms in Ward 2A. And I think I heard yesterday that Capita said they didn't do that, but I think you'll see on the stamp of the drawing, it's Alan Follett's name. So Peter asked them, and there was a bit of the project Peter dealt with, so unfortunately he would give you it in detail. I've only got a high level. We asked Capita to support us in the design process. And they get, just for clarity, I'm not saying that's them signing it off, because the only people who can sign off the design is ZBP and Multiplex, nobody else.
I need to ask you about it because, as emerged yesterday, when Capita were given their contract, it contained a clause which said something like, review all the contract documents, design requirements, which is the material you would need in order to determine whether someone was complying with the contract, as opposed to complying with a contract drawing produced by the contractor, which might or might not be correct. Now, when Capita were challenged on that and said, well, everybody's talking about you doing contract compliance, you've not answered that question, they say, well, look at the top of the page and it says, if asked.
Yeah.
And they said they weren't asked.
Well, Peter did ask them. Peter gave them additional funds in order to do additional work. I'll probably repeat this often. I don't have access to all my files, notes, emails. I wish I had. I really wish I had. Peter had asked Capita and paid Capita to do additional works. And that must be there on record somewhere.
Well, let me take your example, if I can. When we had Mr. Pardee here, we showed Mr. Pardee record that indicated that a non-isolation room in Ward 2A was recorded as having 40 litres per second, which is what we're calling the derogated figure, the 2.5 air changes. Not 6, not 10.
I think it's 3 actually, but yeah.
Okay, well, take it from me, we're not going to quibble between 2.5 and 3.
Let's hope not.
And that figure was also shown to various other people, Ross Ballingall and so on, and they all went, well, that doesn't seem right. Now, that's what Mr. Pardee said. Well, maybe I haven't interpreted this correctly. Maybe I've just been assuming that if it's not an isolation room, it's just an ordinary room. Are you telling us that Capita checked the ventilation specifications for Ward 2A?
No, I'm telling you, Capita checked the ventilation for the 8 PPVL rooms, positive pressure ventilated lobbies, and signed the stamp on the drawing.
Okay.
But I would like to come on to 2A, so hopefully we will come on to 2A at some point to express what I feel about what I think went wrong.
Okay, well, I'll certainly allow you an opportunity to deal with 2A because we want to ask you about it as well.
Thanks.
Right,
just clarifying for my note, Mr. Seabourne.
Sure.
Your evidence is that Peter Moore asked Capita to do a particular piece of work. Now, it's the scope of the piece of work to review the design of the positive pressure
ventilated lobbies, yeah. Excuse me, yeah.
Right, so specific to these lobbied isolation rooms.
No, my lord. He asked him to do some general design review work during the period of 2010, the Appendix K period. And on top of that, he asked him to do some work, and I think David Hall used the term, to review things where multiplex designers were saying, we're not quite compliant, but here's an alternative solution. And you've had that discussion with Steve Pardee, happy to have it again. So when the contractor was saying, this isn't quite in line with ERs, Peter asked Capita, in this particular instance, I don't know many instances, he asked them to run their eye over it with their chartered engineer, Alan Follett, and paid them for that extra work.
Right.
Now that's actually into 2012, so just so that everyone knows, the RDD process ran right up to our letter. It didn't finish. It's a design and build. It continues to move. So I just thought I'd add that.
Okay. Well, I think what his lordship is keen to do is make sure he notes correctly what your evidence is about instructions to Capita. Now, as I heard you give you evidence, and I would like you to make absolutely sure that we're getting this right, it probably splits into two. He'd asked them to do possibly a couple of bits of work where somebody was saying, this isn't quite in accordance with the ER, can you check it? We did hear about a couple of items from them. But also, you say that they were specifically asked to review the ventilation arrangements for the PPVL rooms in Ward 2A, is that right?
Yeah. I've seen the stamp. Right. Alan Follett's name's on the stamp. No, I'll just leave it at that. His name's on the stamp.
Thank you. Let me ask you a completely different question, just because it's next on the, happens to crop up next on your witness statement. You asked who was responsible for Hive scribe assessment. And you say Annette Rankin led on it and subsequently Jackie Stewart, Jackie Barmanroy. Now, I just wanted to ask you one thing. According to Jackie Barmanroy, you told her that that HAI1, the first of these, had been signed off by the project team. Do you have any recollection of that?
I just recollect that. I don't know. I can't remember how many HI scribes there should be in a project. I'm sure you might tell me. But there's a first one, the planning one, and I think it deals with some of the stuff you've asked me about. Is this the right site? Is it near anything hazardous or dangerous, etc.? Are we doing that? Is there buildings, health buildings, local to us that could be affected? I think I'm not an expert in HI scribe. I think Annette did do that one, and I think the next one was done. I think there's 4, and I think we've only got 2 done. And I think I think Jackie done the second one. So yeah, I think Annette did do the first one. That would be my evidence. That was my memory of it.
So, you think Annette did the first one, but did the project team sign off on that as well?
It was for us. If we were coming up to say she didn't, she went, oh no, you can't build that here, then obviously I need to raise that with the chief executive. So, but we weren't getting that feedback. So yeah, it was an internal. I don't mean it was internally being addressed, and as it was a positive, then move on. Next issue.
Can I ask you about infection prevention control involvement in the project? You point out in your witness statement that according to your experience, it hadn't been customary to have any IPC person sort of embedded in the team, whereas you did.
Yeah.
And therefore you say, well, that's a positive for the team that you were leading. And the person embedded tended to be an infection control nurse, is that right?
Yeah.
Now, let me just ask you this question. I can understand that if somebody turns up at a team meeting, which has got the IPC member, and says, oh my God, we've got this problem, here's this complex IPC issue. The nurse can go, well, I've no idea, but I'll go and find out where I can get that information. The other side of the coin, I have to suggest to you, is that if you're discussing topics, issues, as you might do in a large group, how does the nurse know if there's something in that discussion that's flagging a question that they need to take further?
Just the same as me and any other member of the team, we use our initiative, we use our experience, our knowledge, and we generally challenge it or not, as the case may be. That's how it's set up. And if I take IT in the new hospital, I mean IT in the new hospital. Well, bear in mind, 2009 we didn't even have iPads, right? So we're trying to look ahead. IT in the new hospital is very, very complex. And I'm not an IT person, but the IT person doing that same role, we produced an excellent IT system, very complex system in the new hospital. And that's what they were doing. I heard you, Fiona, say the hub and spoke, going back and forward. If Jackie Stewart or Annette hadn't been there, then Peter and I would have to have done that job. And maybe we would have done it differently. We are long experience, but that's what we had and we used that. And if it's a flaw, then no. If you think it's a flaw, it's a flaw. But well, if you go back to the 2 ACADs, they didn't have anything like that. The medical the 2 new hospitals, the Victoria and Stop Hill just completed, so been built for the previous 3 or 4 years. They didn't have anything like that. And the medical director, in fact, the project director, who was Alex McIntyre, told me I didn't really deal with that. Anything that was coming through that might have been about, cancer unit, air rates or whatever, funneled itself through the medical director, seemingly. So So we thought we had a more, not a perfect solid link, but we thought we had a more solid link. And having travelled wide in the UK to look at a whole range of processes to build hospitals in the short period of time I had to learn about it, I didn't come across any other organisation that had that. So we thought we were really doing pretty well, innovative, and that's not for me. I want to make it clear, for me to say this is Jackie or Annette's responsibility. It was just a process we thought would improve things, and maybe it didn't.
I suspect the question is probably more nuanced than that, because I'm not putting questions to you saying this was good, bad, or indifferent.
No,
I'm simply seeking information from you.
Sure.
But one of the topics that we've heard discussed, particularly at the earlier stages of the inquiry, is the extent to which even people who do lots of IPC work know about, for instance, ventilation arrangement. They may be focused on other issues, but they're not necessarily experts in ventilation. So I suppose that the question then becomes, if you want to ask, something crops up about, safe disposal of clinical waste or something, you might think the nurse will go, well, I know a wee bit about that, but I know another nurse who knows more. But it might be challenging. Would you agree, if you're starting to get into ventilation issues, for them to spot where the issues are?
I don't expect them to maybe spot the potential outcome rather than the system being designed to produce the outcome. If we carry on a wee bit in the design process, you'll see the renal user group, and you've had this discussion, although it's not quite correct the way it was discussed from what I gather. In the renal discussion user group, Jackie then goes to Craig Williams, who's the head ICD, and he tells her to go to Peter Hoffman, right? So I'm not getting into detail of that. I'm just telling you that's the link made. So they want to reduce air changes. Jackie recognises from a clinical perspective that could be an issue. She sees the senior, and the senior says, go and ask an expert. So that's it working perfectly. Now, I'm not saying it worked perfectly in every case, but that was the reason for the user groups. That was the reason for the project team. That was the reason for Jackie being there. And that was the reason for her seeking advice and getting advice back. And that advice that he gave us, and we'll come on to talk about it, I'm sure, made us all feel, all right, we're fine with some of the decisions we've made here.
As I explained to Mr. Seabourne, we're trying to look with the benefit of hindsight at things that may or may not have worked well to see whether things could be made to work better. That's all we're doing. We're not looking to say you were responsible for the the performance of the ICN system.
Sure.
So please understand that.
No, and I'm new to this process, so please forgive me if I'm misunderstanding.
The topic of BREM, BREM, has cropped up repeatedly, and I'm not going to take up your time debating that, but that's where your correction to your witness statement comes in.
Yeah.
So if we can go to, it's page 138 of the electronic bundle, and it's at the foot where the sentence makes no sense, as it's said at the moment. This sentence says, at no time can I recall myself or anyone else associated with the project ever prioritising safety over BREM. That's clearly intended to be BREM over safety. Is that correct?
Yeah, you must have thought that was a godsend when you saw that. Yeah.
No, I actually had it noted as an error.
Oh,
but
thank you.
In any event, you've intimated to us that the two words have been transposed, and your position is, as I suspect a number of other witnesses have already said, we did not prioritise BREM over safety.
Never.
It's your position.
Never. Yeah.
Well, I was about to move on to the what we're calling the ventilation derogation, but I wonder whether it might therefore be sensible to pause now.
Mrs. Seabourne, as I indicated, we take a coffee break. So could I ask you to be back for 11:45?
Certainly not.